everyone. Welcome to the second series of the teaching sessions of No Pride in Policing. My name is Kusha. I go by they or he. And today we're going to be talking about drag performers resisting fascism, racism, and heteromasculinity. I'm your moderator. My name is Kusha again. And I am a trans masculine person of color. I came here as a refugee in 1995, and I've been working within the trans and queer community for the past 20 years. And the bulk of my work is around trans refugees and abolition and incarceration, particularly of trans refugees. So I'm going to start. I'm really excited about this. So today we have two amazing panelists. So our first panelist is Jade Electra. Jade Electra is a Toronto-based out HIV queer African American drag entertainer, recording artist, vocalist, film, stage, television actor, and AIDS activist, originally from Tampa, Florida, via New York City, and finally found a home in Toronto at the end of 2009. By 1993, Jade formed a drag review called The Illusion, and so was performing in various venues throughout Harlem. As Jade Electra, King is most noted for his activism through his music, which can be found on iTunes, Spotify, and YouTube. Okay, so our next panelist is Ryan Persadie. Ryan Persadie is an artist, educator, and writer based in Toronto, Canada. Currently, he is a doctoral candidate in Women and Gender Studies and Sexual Diversity Studies and Senior Doctoral Fellow in Caribbean Studies at the University of Toronto. His aesthetic and scholarly work investigate queer Caribbean diasporas, transnational feminism, and sexualities, performance, and Afro-Asian intimacy. His writings can be found in the Starbroke News, Gay City News, Music Cultures, and the Caribbean Review of Gender Studies. He also works and organizes with multiple community groups, including the Caribbean Equity Project based in Queens, New York. Outside of academia, Ryan also performs as a drag artist when he or she goes by the stage name of Tifa Wine, drawing on lessons passed down from soca and chutney music and traditions such as carnival. So I'm really excited to have this conversation with you too. This is a really important conversation at the moment because, as we know, with the growth of fascism, one of the things that comes up is these things around gender norms. And that's one of the things that fascism thrives on. And the other aspect of it that I was thinking about, which is something that we could also talk about later on, is the fact that, these particularly, conservative or neoliberal governments, they try to, they do actually mask certain things with pointing out and scapegoating, particularly, folks who are outside the gender norm or perform something other than expected, right? So that's usually historically been the case. And it feels like that's thriving again in some ways, unfortunately. So it's important to have these conversations. I guess let's get started with the question. So again, let's talk about the connection between fascism, transphobia, homophobia, and maintaining gender norms, which is, I think, something is important to start with. I guess whoever is ready to go first. Yeah. How do you feel that's connected, and what are your thoughts on that?
I guess that I'm going first. I was waiting for you, Ryan. Well, I'm in an interesting kind of box here for this conversation because I'm the American that's in the room that actually lives in Canada. So I can speak to some of the history of what I know of, I guess, how conservative views have tried to frame things around the LGBT community. So these recent bans on drag shows and storybook time and all of that stuff is a real big smokescreen, in my opinion. It is a way for them to kind of roll back LGBT rights. And they'll do it through the gauze of we're protecting the children from the drag queens. But what that also entails is what is a drag queen and who is, who's going into this bathroom. And if this person looks suspect, then we need to like make sure that they can't go in. And I just smell a lawsuit coming for that because there's some women out there who are more masculine than I am out of drag. So I can only imagine some poor woman being dragged out of a bathroom, being told that she's a trans person or a drag queen. So it's opening doors for some really major bad things to happen. And it's also fueling a lot of the hatred and a lot of the problems of hate crimes because of people are beginning to think that they have the right to act upon what they think they see or what they think they know. So, but Ryan, why don't you jump in?
Yeah, for sure. First of all, thank you so much for having me. This is so great. Yeah, I will think, the question is asking us to think about the connections that sort of live outside of drag, but then sort of show up in drag as well. And so I even think it's interesting, like just thinking from a place like Jade, you said you're from the States originally, but thinking I only have ever done drag in Toronto. And what has been pretty revealing when I first started was about how the sort of goal of drag as being this thing that's grounded in the non-normative and in this thing that allows us to actually rehearse who we want to be doesn't always get met, particularly in this space when there's so much transphobia and misogyny that exists in this one space that we call drag. And I can even think about when I first started in the Toronto Village, which was like about 8 years ago. People were still not ready to have conversations about, say, women, right? Women taking part in drag in the same way. Whereas now I think there's been a lot of people sort of pushing the agenda of like what drag can be. So thinking about, an AFAB person doing drag, right? Or thinking about trans women who do drag, even though drag is historically a trans woman art form, right? And I think those sorts of erasures and limitations particularly get missed. And I think a lot of this has to do with partly amnesia about who we think we are as drag artists, right? I think about, even watching things now like RuPaul's Drag Race. I like put a tweet out the other day saying like RuPaul's Drag Race feels so antithetical to drag in terms of what drag for me is supposed to be, right? It has turned into such like you use the language of neoliberal, right? But it has turned into such of like standardized copy paste framework of, you need to have all these checks to make the show. And that's sort of the standard that's being produced, right? At the same time that all these other things are being produced, like anti-Blackness on the show, misogyny, trans misogyny, classism, et cetera, et cetera. And that's just like one very small example, but we see the ways in which actually what has been really hard for me as a drag artist is witnessing sort of this separation between what people call political drag, which doesn't make sense to me because all drag is politicized, whether you're doing overt political numbers or not. But this sort of separation between like, there's a conventional like mainstream drag, and then there's political drag, and then there's like all these other, like they're creating all these genres of drag, right? And I'm not meant to saying this because I want all drag to be the same, but because what ends up happening, like in fascism or like in nationalism, is that there becomes a blueprint and a template for how to access the normative, right? And so there is, in our own spaces, all these sorts of things happen. And I mean, obviously, I'd love to hear from Jade too, because Jade's been doing drag longer than I have in a different city. So I also wonder how this plays out in the context of the States or differently. But even thinking about in the Toronto scene, like there's this thing called marathon drag, which many of us have been forced to do Jade's already making faces, already knows, she knows exactly what I'm talking about. But this culture of going to a bar, being hired to work at a bar, and like having to perform like 17 numbers in a row, right? And I think recently a lot of us, particularly the folks that I grew up starting to drag in the city, were really resistant to performing in this way because it removes all the sort of creative capacity of performance. When you're just being, asked to pump out 17 numbers in a row, it turns into a factory, right? And it turns into drag becoming a means to bring people in and therefore buy drinks and produce more sales for the bar, as opposed to like coming to a drag show for like art, right? For like political transgressive art. And I think, again, to speak to some of these sorts of connections, the inherent sort of elitism that's being sort of brought into drag and classism that's being brought into drag is sort of really scary sometimes. So there's all these sorts of things going on that I think as drag artists, we need to be really sort of cognizant and be accountable to, because I feel like so much of it gets like slipped under the radar and we're always trying to like catch up afterwards.
Well, let's see, there's a lot to unpack from that. I guess I should start by letting everyone know that I am 55 years old. I started drag in 1985 back in Florida. And back then, drag was all, it was all inclusive because of all the drag queens and all the transsexuals. We were all just sisters and we just did drag. It wasn't like some of us had augmentation and other things, and others were just straight up boys who created a look and a form and did everything. And I kind of miss that. I miss it a lot because of we learned from each other and there were no classes in it. You were either a good performer or you weren't. That's it. And you brought up RuPaul's Drag Race. For years, I know everyone hates when I say this, but I do not like that show. I never liked that show because it's not about drag. It is, I'm assuming that it's about you're supposed to try and become RuPaul and no one's going to be RuPaul. That time period and her whole run in show business, that's already happened. It won't happen again. Madonna won't happen again. These, you can emulate something, but it's not going to happen again. You have to carve out your own path, your own thing. So what this show to me has been is an excuse for bad behavior. And you're being rewarded for it. And so it's reality television first, before anything. So it has nothing to do with drag. It doesn't teach you anything. The queens now, younger girls, they look at a tutorial on YouTube and they think they got it and they're ready to go. That's not how we learned back in the day. You learned by trial and error. You learned by an older queen telling you like, oh girl, don't do that, or here, try this. That doesn't happen now. Like, everyone's kind of left on their own. I'm sure that the girls have their friends and they help each other or whatever, but the mentorship, this is part of what's happened to the LGBT community. And I spent a lot of time speaking about it. I just finished my residency at the University of Toronto, where I was speaking on community leadership. And basically what I tried to hammer into everyone's head was that we lost a whole generation of people to HIV and AIDS. And those were people who could have taught our young people at that time what to expect, what to do, how we survived back whenever. So now everything is like a footnote. I was in the 80s when AIDS was very prominent and people died like every other week. But now the rebranding of HIV and AIDS, you see a commercial on TV and it's, oh, take this pill and you live a normal life. That's not the case. And so my job as an elder is to make sure that younger people understand that that's an illusion that they want you to think. And it's causing other problems because of those commercials are causing governments to think, oh, it's under control, so we don't have to throw any money at it. So now we're losing funding for a lot of our AIDS organizations and they are beginning to close up shop. And people are like thinking, oh, you're just going to take this pill and you're going to be fine. But the services that go along with being HIV positive, those things are disappearing, or they're hurting because of everyone thinks that it's under control, and it's not. So, but I'm sorry, I've spiraled into the HIV thing. But the drag situation, I started in Florida. I moved to New York City, and that was a major education. And it's funny that you said, I think one of the things you said, Ryan, was that you get to practice what you want to be or who you want to be. And so I ended up in the ballroom scene, and I was in the House of La Beja. So that's a whole thing of pretending and projecting what it is that you want to be and who you want the world to see you as. And the more real you are, the better you are at it. And that means that you're real enough not to be clocked. So then, that leads into this whole thing about trans and drag, of who's clockable and who's not, and what does that mean? And even though we're talking about the heterosexual normative aspect of this, we ourselves, our own community, we have classes and categories, and we discriminate against our own in a lot of situations because of this person's too heavy, or this person is this, or whatever. So there's so much to unpack in this discussion, and I hope that we can touch on some of it. But there's so much, like, we could write books about how much we need to work on and what needs to be fixed.
Thank you for that. Yeah, one of the things that came to my mind when you were talking about HIV, Jade, was that I wonder, like, because when it first started, the government intentionally wasn't putting money into medication or cutting off people off of it, right? And I feel like that's been repeated again. And I wonder if, again, we're going through the same thing where they're intentionally cutting off these services, just like they're cutting off many other services from marginalized communities, which is a bigger issue. But yeah, and as you were saying, you were talking, Ryan, about how about drag being political. And yes, I mean, inherently it is political, because it's through that creativity we're trying to, we are creating these worlds for ourselves, for ourselves, the way we see it, which is a form of resistance in itself, right? So yeah, it's I think that's why it's important to have these conversations, right? And a big part of it, I think, around, unfortunately, I feel like when we talk in a lot of communities that are like-minded, like abolitionist and left-wing, unfortunately, I think what happens is that we cannot organize the way that right organizes, right? And that's something that we definitely need to work on. And there's a lot of issues around that, I think. One of them is being like, we tend to have less compassion with each other when we make mistakes, or it's something that we disagree on, right? So I'm wondering if I can get your thoughts around that, around like, how do we overcome this huge barrier for us? Because it's important. We need to learn to organize better amongst each other and be more compassionate, and not just be like, okay, I don't agree with you on this thing, so, forget it. Like, this person, it's gone now. Like during the convoy, for example, I always kind of try to think of this and use this as an example of this. There was a lot of people with legitimate, concerns, and there was a good opportunity for progressive folks, for folks on the left spectrum to gain a platform there. But it was totally taken over by fascism, because they know how to, grab those situations and go with it, if you will. So yes, with that being said, I would like to get your thoughts on that. Maybe Ryan, if you could start this time.
Sure. I'm just thinking of all the parts of your question, but the sort of last part of this question of compassion and also generosity, I think, is really important. So like, I also think about, like, I'm a student of transnational feminism. So, you know, we think a lot about how do we actually build solidarity outside of ourselves, meaning how do we think beyond the I question towards the we question? And that doesn't mean trying to sort of lump us all into being all the same, but actually understanding our positionalities and differences. And then how do we actually build solidarity across difference? I think that's sort of the hard question, right? Is for, I think a lot of us, what I think about too is even in the drag community, I don't feel a sense of community in the city, right? I feel like there's lots of camps. And I mean, Jade also, like, let me know how you also feel about this too. I feel like there's a very particular mainstream respectability politics in drag that's attached to capital, meaning you can't be too disruptive to sort of what's happening in the city, because there are people who own bars and there are people who are interested in making money. And those are the people that don't cause too much trouble. So, you know, I think I've, particularly in this drag scene, been seen as a sort of like shit disturber or a troublemaker, because for me, drag is not about trying to occupy mediocre, you know, neutral politics, right? For me, drag always starts in the radical, particularly with trans women of color who've taught us about, like, taking us towards the edge of where we are, right? Like, the term radical means to take you beyond the edge of thought, right? And, you know, for me, drag is not about trying to imitate womanhood or look like a woman, but actually to sit within femininity as a teaching resource, right? And to think about, and not just femininity, also a lot of drag artists play with masculinity and play with androgyny, and that really depends like what sort of journey you're on in your drag, right? But drag really forces you outside of your body in particular ways, right? Because, you know, for a lot of us, drag operates as, it can be a shield for some people, it can be confidence for other people, but also for a lot of folks, it's actually where they access their truer selves, right? Which is why, you know, I think so many folks, you know, may start off doing drag a certain way, and then in terms of their gender may present differently as they get into it. And so drag becomes this real important space for a lot of people to access non-normative forms of gender, meaning gender outside the mainstream that maybe they can't access in the public space, right? Or that may not as be safe to do in the public space. But there's a real sort of dangerous tendency to be this like good queer subject in Toronto, I think, right? If not to like ruffle anyone's feathers, you know, and for me, I mean, I can tell stories about, there's been certain times, and not to like out anyone, but there's an older drag artist who's performs in the Village a lot, who's notorious for sort of drawing upon anti-Black and Orientalist and Islamophobic tropes in their set very avidly. And I remember a bunch of us at the time were witnessing this and, you know, obviously not wanting to cancel this older drag artist who was obviously like an important figure in the scene. But at the same time, important people also make mistakes, right? And so we were trying to, like, I remember a lot of people were talking about it online, and it was really interesting to see, especially a bunch of older older white gay male who go to bars like Woody's and Cruise and Tangos and, you know, O'Grady's, and that's what they do. And they've been around and seen the Toronto Village sort of change over the last few decades. And of course, we're coming in here saying, well, actually harmful jokes like this aren't jokes. Like, this is not comedy, to make, you know, to poke fun at someone's like literal lived reality, you know? And so many people were like, oh my God, you're creating division in the community. Why don't you focus on, you know, the issues? And for them, the issues were just sexuality, right? For them, queerness is just about sexuality, and it has nothing to do with race or gender or class or religion, when of course all of these things produce sexuality all the time, right? But again, I think we're often met with like, when we try to do this work, we don't get canceled in the same way, but people will not book you, right? Like, I think there's certain drag artists that I feel like they are my people in terms of we have the same political commitments, right? And then there are certain people I know that are never going to book me because I'm never going to be that person to just do you know, the same old 4 songs over and over again just for the sake of entertainment. Like for me, again, drag is this really political archive for taking us outside of ourselves, right? And actually taking us outside of our bodies and allowing us to experiment and play, which is not currently available, right? But if we are to take that politics seriously, how is it then at the same time we can have people in our community say things like, you know, I built my career off of the femininity that was taught to me by trans women, but at the same time, no trans women allowed in our spaces. Like that sort of like contradiction becomes so ridiculous to me. And obviously on Drag Race, that's something that's been played out over and over again, but it happens in our communities all the time. Like in terms of Toronto too, and I'm sure, you know, Jade could also speak to this based on their experience, is like, there have been parties such as like the Queen of Halloween that have like come under fire for not allowing non-traditional what they call non-traditional drag artists to take part in the space. And their version of non-traditional drag artists was mostly like drag kings, anyone who plays with masculinity, and like AFAB folks, so like cis women who are also doing drag or whatever, right? And there was so much uproar about this in terms of like this traditional drag versus non-traditional drag, but what they're casting as non-traditional drag is not non-traditional, it's just what they don't want to see, right? It's just a very patriarchal voice saying we don't want women in this space, even though women, you know, cis and trans, have been the ones to teach us and allow us to access our femininity, right? Like when you think about like queer icons, all the gay icons are women, and that's not for coincidence, right? That's because they're providing some sense of like hyper femininity that particularly a lot of gay and trans mod want to access, right? And feel that they maybe can't access. So it's just, for me, so contradictory for people to be like, well, I'm going to use this archive of femininity that was gifted to me by trans women, but then remove them from the same space that they helped create. It's just, again, I think a lot of it has to do with like amnesia and really forgetting like, what was drag supposed to be? And like, what are we actually doing? Like, is it actually drag? And I mean, I also get in, people don't like when I say that as well, but you know, I often think about, if the aim for you as a drag artist is to just wear makeup, that's you're basically a model, right? If the aim for you is just to turn out looks after looks after looks, then maybe you're a stylist. But a drag queen is someone who uses the aesthetic to actually want to rehearse a newness to the world, right? It's not just about public consumption, and it's not just about Instagram likes and follows and who can turn out the most looks and who can buy the most expensive costumes. I think that's what it's turned into in a lot of spaces, which is really hard to see because, you know, when I look back to like the drag of the 1970s and 80s and the drag of today, it's like night and day sometimes, right? About what sort of, and this is not everywhere. Obviously, there are pockets of people doing really important work, but they're not the ones being seen, right? They're not the ones being represented who are actually fulfilling the promise of what drag was supposed to be. I mean, what we're seeing now is a lot of influencer culture being veiled by drag, right? So they're calling it drag, and we can, you know, debate all day about what that means. But I think there is a real sort of shift that's really making it hard for our communities, specifically the younger ones that are coming into it, to actually read into what drag is supposed to be. Like have a literacy for the political power of drag beyond just drag is about Instagram and photos and wigs and all that sort of stuff.
Well, let's see. The outsider. That's what I've been most of my years here in Toronto. And I'm probably going to get in trouble, or canceled or whatever, which I don't even know what that means or how that's going to happen, because I'm still going to be here when I finish what I have to say. And I'm still going to breathe. I'm still going to have a place to live, all of those things. So I'm about to tell some truths. Back in 2013, I was canceled because of, I spoke up about Daytona Bitch. And most people don't want to remember, they want to remember her the way that they remember her or whatever. And I can tell you, she was a friend of mine and she was very funny. She was, you know, I knew that she had off-color ideas about what she would say on stage. She had some of the stuff she'd say on stage I would never, ever remotely even repeat. But, you know, that was her humor, fine. But when she decided to do blackface the week before Pride on a Sunday night at Cruise and Tangos, I happened to see the pictures the next morning, and there were all kinds of crazy hashtags attached to it, to the photos. And I just wrote, I don't know what to say about this. Literally, that is what I wrote. It was my husband who went online and read her a new one. And he's white. And, but I got blamed for it. And I get a phone call the next day. Someone tells me, oh, you should go back to that thread and read what they're writing about you. And there was all of this stuff, really popular queens who are now big on the scene or whatever, telling me that I needed to go back to the US with my American problems, and that that, you know, we don't have that kind of racism here. She was just doing, you know, this was just for fun or whatever. And then it was, she even asked some Black people who worked at Cruise and Tangos if it was okay for her to do it. And I'm just like, what are y'all talking about? This is so not what you need to be doing the week of Pride or ever. So I decided to write a blog about all of the racist things that I had seen from 2010 up until then, and just called it all out. Well, I became public enemy #1. So I stopped getting booked at most of the places. The only place that would book me was Zippers, because Harry, I guess he just didn't care. But Woody's wouldn't book me. Cruise and Tangos canceled my show, like all of this stuff. And then they thought that they were punishing me because I'm a DJ out of drag. They thought they were punishing me by making me work with Daytona on Mondays. But the only one who was being punished was her, because if she started watching what she had to say on stage, it didn't bother me. I came in and got my money like I was supposed to. But the thing of it is that I believe had more Black people or more people of color had spoken up in that moment, things might have been different later. So we could have started the conversation about race then and kind of said, hey, this isn't okay. And by the way, we're not included in your Pride discussions of what's going to happen. You've thrown us in this little space over here, and you know, you're like, okay, yeah, you do whatever you're doing over there, but this is the main stage, and this is this, and you know, that's when we should have been having this conversation. So by the time we get to 2016 and Black Lives Matters disrupts the parade, that's when we really got a good look at how the good old boy system works. So a lot of white gay men were furious and went online spewing all kinds of terrible things. And the problem is that they don't see racism because they don't experience it. So they don't know that Black people have problems going into this bar, or that the police harass them, or any of those things, because that's not their experience. And if you don't have that experience, then you can't speak on it, and it doesn't exist to you. So, and they, you know, things have been working just fine the way they were. So why are we changing this? I was around for the whole debacle with the women that wanted to get into the Queen of Halloween or whatever. And, you know, I don't know. I remember there used to be a show, LL Cool J used to host whatever that lip sync battle thing or whatever it was. And I remember thinking to myself, damn, can't we have anything? Because, you know, we started this, we did this, and now all of a sudden it wants to go mainstream, but that's part of the effect of Drag Race. Like everyone sees it, then all of a sudden they want to do it too. And I don't know, the participation ribbon mentality, not everyone can be a drag queen. Not everyone can do, somebody's got to lose. We can't all, you know, if everybody's doing the same thing, then nothing is special about it and nothing great will come out of it. So I understand letting women do drag or whatever, but if we have spaces where it's supposed to be a drag competition, and then it gets blurry, because I come from a time when transsexuals and drag queens shared the same space. But there is a distinction also of creating an art form. I believe what it is that I do, I create an art form. I've created this illusion of what you're looking at right now. I don't look like this. I don't walk around in my everyday life like this. Lord, I would kill myself if I had to, because it's a lot of work. But for those who want to live as women or whatever, it used to be in my time was that if you wanted to be a woman, you divorced yourself from the drag thing and you went on to live as a woman. You went, and that was the thing, was like, I know a lot of transsexuals from my time period who were like, okay, well, I'm hanging up my drag because I'm going to go and live as a woman. I'm no longer going to have done all this work or whatever. And, you know, some of them went on to become strippers. Some of them became models. Some of them like did all this stuff. And we applauded them like, girl, go, you know. So it's murky. It's very, very murky in that area. And some of it, I'm like, okay, I want us all to be at the same table. Other things, I'm like, okay, can't we have something for our community that is just ours? So, you know, someone's going to cancel me for saying that, but I had to say it. To rewind back to the marathon shows, Chal, that was the other reason why I couldn't work on Church Street, is because of, you're not going to hand me this little amount of money and have me on stage for 3 hours, you know, and taking up my time. On top of, I'm a recording artist as well. So like, you know, some of the places wanted me to sing. And when I do gigs where I perform my music, we start at $500. We're not, you know, so handing me $100 or $125 for me to be on stage for 3 hours or in the building for 3 hours, that's just not, it's not worth it. And the other part of it is that less is always more. If you had 2 shows in an evening and there were specific times that they started, the people would show up for them and watch them. Give the girls time to go and mingle in between shows and have a drink with the customers, and then go back and give it their all. 1, maybe 2 numbers per show, and that's it. Wow them, give them the best, as opposed to having to come up with all of these numbers and killing yourself. And also, you know, we've all watched drag shows, so the longer you're on stage, the longer it is that they're going to dissect you and tear you apart. But if you come out and you wow them and give them your best numbers, you're just going to blow them away. And that's going to be it. And that's going to be great. But like, less is always more. It always has been, and it's always going to be. The way that they do shows here in Toronto, you girls are killing it. You're killing the art form. And also, Toronto needs to be a destination. It can't be, because they don't operate that way. There's nothing here for you to see. You could see the same girl on stage here and go right across the street and see the same girl again, because she double booked herself that night. That would never happen. You should never have that. But they do it, you know, and, you know, so, and I can't be a human jukebox. I can't go on stage and just do all whatever the latest hits or whatever. I do numbers that reflect who I am and what I want to say. And so that was the other problem for bookings on Church Street for me, was because of, I'm not their typical drag queen. And also because I'm not of Caribbean descent, and I'm not going to do soca numbers because it's not part of my background. I don't fit in the box that white gay men think Black drag queens should be for Toronto. So Eartha Kitt, Della Reese, and all of the classic things that I know, those are wasted. No one wants to see them, according to the managers of these bars or whatever. However, if they had a variety of people in the show, and it was 2 shows in the evening, there would be something for everyone. So that would work a lot better than the aesthetic of what they're doing right now. But anyway, I'm gonna get off my soapbox. We're gonna move on.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, when you were talking, Jade, about like how, you know, you go there and they give you $100 for 3 hours, which is like, I can't even imagine. Like, and I think this is also connected to this capitalistic, individualistic culture that we live in. It's kind of like, you know, the narrative that you should be thankful that you're here and you got this gig, whereas like this beautiful art form is creating a different world. It's a form of resistance, right? So, I mean, yeah. And I think when you were talking about, US, it's a good segue to our next question. And this is, I think, you might be able to answer this particularly from your experience, Jade. So the narrative in Canada, it's always that, we're a safe haven for LGBTQ folks, we're noble, we're accepting, we're this, we're that. Look over there, the States, we're not that. Whereas we know the history, the violent history of it. We know that even in terms of like, if you look at the queer history, even in Toronto, the things that have happened that's been violent with the police, the bathhouse raid, the raid of Pussy Palace, all of those things, right? Which is just tip of the iceberg if you look at the history. And so I think it is important to really push back against this narrative, especially now, because in Canada, sometimes it's just so insidious, insidious, and it might not be right in your face in many places, right? But here, like I used to work at the school board, at the Ottawa Common School Board in Ottawa. And my job was particularly working with, I was the trans and gender diverse and support coordinator, working with young trans students. And the pushback that was there, particularly from parents, there was like a huge Twitter storm calling me a groomer and this and that. So we can't say that this is just happening in the US. And it's, in Canada as well. So I wanted to get your thoughts on that in particular, Jade, if you can elaborate a little bit on that, like talk about your own experiences,
It's crazy to me. Okay, so I'm not going to name this person's name because he's a friend of my husband's. But we know a person that posts all day long about how horrible the US is and all the terrible things that they do. And they're just crazy down there. They're gun-toting, horrible people, blah, 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 blah. And, I had to unfollow him because of, I don't want to get into an argument. I don't want to have that every day, because he does it every day. But it's interesting to me to watch Canadians point the finger at the US, and the very same thing that they're talking about is happening right here under their nose, and they're not aware of it, and they're under the spell that like, we're so much better than the US, so we don't have those problems here. But in actuality, they're happening every day right here. You don't have dead bodies in the streets every day, and Black people aren't dying like they were back in 2020 and 2019, all of that stuff. But the racism and the transphobia and all the homophobia and all of these small little micro aggressions that happen are setting the stage for things to get worse. And so, as soon as something happens in the States, like the convoy thing that you brought up, I was like, oh, geez. Okay, so because of January 6th, Canada has to have their own version of it. And it's sponsored by Fox News, because Fox started like promoting it and talking about it and sending support to the truckers. And I'm just like, wow. And that's how this whole fascism thing works, is that like, okay, so we see a problem happening over here. Let's throw some money behind that and help them continue this so we can make our message stronger. But the problem with what's going on with the people who are sponsoring these things is that they don't really have any real plans or solutions. So what they're doing is I think it's the line in a Michael Jackson song, you're throwing rocks to hide your hand. They're doing all of the stuff, throwing the stuff against the wall of drag queens are doing this and men are going into women's bathrooms and all of this stuff to divert from the real problems and the things that need to be fixed, because they're too busy getting their palms greased by lobbyists and corporations. So therefore, you know, we don't want that to stop. I still want to have my vacation and whatever, and I want to have my summer home and I want to have my winter home. And this is how I've been doing it for years. If this suddenly stops, then I'm not going to have these things. And they're only thinking of themselves. They're not thinking of we, they're thinking of me. And so I'm watching all of the stuff play out in the States, and I'm like, it's just seconds away from happening here. And if you're not careful, if you elect the wrong person, you know, everyone's like, well, how did Trump get in or whatever? Trump is a direct response to Obama spending 8 years in the White House. And people were really angry. The racist people were really, really angry. So they spun whatever they could spin. He's not an American. We want to see his birth certificate, all of those things. And on top of it, he started a we conversation that they didn't want to have, because in order to have the we conversation, you're going to have to address some of the things that happened in the past. And that means that you're going to have to address slavery. You're going to have to address all of the, you know, all the bad things that have been done. We can't fix them until we talk about them and we address them. And they know addressing them is going to make them feel bad. And no one wants to feel bad, but you can't feel better until you feel bad. You have to actually go in and talk about these things. So I want Canadians to take a breath the next time that they want to say something about the US, because the US is just a bigger version of you. That's all. It's just got more people. So therefore, it seems more crazy because of there's more people there. But the same thing is going on here. And the same, you know, Rob Ford and all of them, they have their agendas in place, and they want to get in power and stay in power so they can tell everyone, oh, this is the way it should be done. And let's cut back on this and let's cut this because we don't really need that. That's no longer a problem. So, you know, that's what I would say about about the US and Canada and how people perceive what's going on.
No, and absolutely, they're already starting to do that. Like, you know, that's for like cutting all these things, but like, you know, also like fueling all these things around like yeah, flags going up, like rainbow flags going up in school, things like that, right? So he's just like, oh, look at this, I'm doing this, like, you know, just, you know, like I said, they're trying to just take people's attention away from what actually is going on by pointing out to those things and making it seem like this is the danger, not that, when actually those are the ones that we need to be paying attention to, right? The things that the policies are bringing up, the things that they're doing. And there's a great chance that, unfortunately, Pierre Poilievre, who's a fascist, is going to win the next election. You know, so the same thing, exact same thing, right? So yes, 100%, I think.
Actually, I just realized I said the wrong Ford, didn't I? I said Rob Ford instead of Doug Ford, or
Yeah.
did I?
I mean, they're both.
I mean, it's about the same thing. But the funny thing is, the U.S. was laughing at Canada for when Rob was in office and smoking crack. And they were like, oh, how, you know, why don't you just kick him out? Because that had never happened before. So they had to do procedure. They couldn't just get out. You had to vote him out and do whatever you needed to do. And so when Trump comes along, everyone's like, I don't see how you know, he got in and why you don't just kick him out or whatever. They've never had a candidate like Trump before, someone who would say and do anything in front of the cameras. And then on top of it, he attacked all of the other Republican candidates which they had never had. They were used to decorum and an actual way of speaking to each other and doing debates. He went in and did completely the opposite and just went in and said whatever he wanted to, and they weren't prepared. And so that's how he got into where he was. And then the people who believed that him getting into office was going to somehow rub off on them and they were all going to prosper, which is the craziest thing in the world, because of the people who support him are the poorest people and really need the services that they're cutting back, and they're going to need them. But they think because of the agenda of let's keep this racist thing in place, let's keep the gays and all of these people in their place, and this is the way to do it. They don't realize that they're cutting off their nose to spite their face. So, in the end, he's going to be richer than what he is. He's already asking you for more money. Why is he asking you for money if he's a millionaire or billionaire or whatever? They're not thinking on those things. They're thinking, oh, we got to help him get back into the White House. You don't need to help him. You would help him by your vote. That's it. You don't need to give him any more money. But they don't see it that way. They think they have to invest in keeping life the way that they think that it should be, or the way it used to be, because they don't like having the conversations that are happening now. So, but anyway, sorry.
Okay. No, thank you. Ryan, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, this is, I guess, an important question. It's funny that you asked. I was literally talking to my students about this morning, right? This American versus Canadian sort of nationalism, or how they see things as worse than. But I think it's also part of the ways in which, like, a very particular version of like Canadian nationalism is always sort of like subtle in comparison to the States. It doesn't mean it's any better off than. I mean, because all the same things we're talking about still happen here, right? For instance, it's weird that Canada sees itself as this sort of peacekeeper nation where all the sort of queer asylum seekers and refugees come to, where we had this like gay blood donation ban for like literally decades, right? And so, it shows the ways in which, people, especially like Justin Trudeau, has really tried to like push this narrative that he cares, right? Because he was the first prime minister to walk in a pride parade, right? And he says all the things that people want to hear, but then when it comes to like literal actions, right, we never really see these things like play out in the same way, except when things like actually come from the people. So like obviously with like Pride, right, it wasn't until BLM that so many other like stages, like particularly the South Asian stage, a lot of the East Asian stages, Indigenous programming was advocated for by BLM when they protested, right? But it literally took them like shutting down the entire thing for people to take it seriously. And then even so, when they did that, they got called thugs, they got disturbers, they got called, gangly, like all this really anti-Black language of criminalization was used on them, particularly because they were advocating for things that were necessary, right? It was urgent. It wasn't about, just being around that day. So, but yeah, Canada really loves to maintain this narrative that we're like better than, when we're not at all. It's just a different form of racism that lives differently. It just doesn't, just because it's not happening in the same way as the States doesn't mean it's any better, right? And I often think about how, despite cities like Toronto and Montreal and Vancouver being quite multicultural, once you leave these big sort of major urban spaces, you really come to see how white Canada is. Like I always remember, like when I was growing up, my parents wanted a dog, so they got a dog for my sister, right? And so we had to go to this like breeder in Georgetown, because I grew up in Mississauga, in Georgetown, which I was thinking Georgetown's like 20 minutes away, like it's not that far. But suddenly you like walking down the street, and my dad is like a dark-skinned Indo-Caribbean man, so he like definitely like drew attention. And it was just like very weird to feel like we were not able to be in space there. Like people were kind of looking at us and talking to us like, you're not from here, you don't belong here, like go back to Toronto type of thing, which was very strange. And I don't think, it doesn't need to be said in the way that it still has an impact, right? About you feeling not safe there, you feel like you don't belong there. Not that I need to feel belonging to a place, but you do see the way in which like we feel very safe in Toronto because of the sort of mixture that's made the city possible in the way that it lives right now. But you go to other places, right? Or even like, I think with Quebec all the time, the sort of like French imperialism that's happening there, right? Particularly in relation to like Haitian folks and Arab folks, right? From places like Algeria, the Islamophobia that sort of lives in that space. And, there's a whole other things we can talk about in direct relationship to that. But yeah, this whole narrative is really important to really critique because it just doesn't exist. It's a mythology, right? It's not something, it is not better here than anywhere else. It's just, again, trying to create a narrative that wants to turn away from what's happening here and blame someone else, right? They want to weaponize these things so that they don't have to contend with what's happening, in this place. Like I always tell my students too, like, Canada also has a history of slavery because that ends up becoming the thing that they use to say like, well, we're better than the States because like we didn't have slavery, but it's like, yes, we did, right? We also had Indigenous genocide. Like it's not, and even in a more, in the last 100 years, it's been really interesting to see like what's happening with a lot of these Ukrainian refugees because in one point in time, the Ukrainian was put in a concentration camp, right? Like during like the world wars and like there were actual like anti-Ukrainian discourse that was produced by the Canadian government, such as there was anti-Japanese discourse during World War II, right? Where there were internment camps set up, right? To actually like dislocate these people, right? And some of which caused premature death, right? But it's interesting now to see this turn and particularly how Ukraine is being treated versus places like Sudan, right? Where, I'm sure everyone heard about all those journalists, reviews of what was happening in Ukraine. Like, how could this happen to these like, blue-haired, blonde-haired, blue-eyed people? Like they're like us, meaning in the white European sort of context, right? But that sort of generosity has never been given to the Sudanese, right? Or any other person who's escaping any sort of form of like violence and war and conflict, right? Like that generosity is often very selective and very racialized, right? Which helps us to think about how, Canadian racism kind of lives in this like everyday vernacular. Like that's what Hamani Banerjee calls it, right? This sort of everyday nature of racism that lives in our country. And obviously it is different depending on where you go. But I think, in the drag space too, I'm someone who's been, again, not canceled, but sort of notoriously known for thinking about appropriation in the drag scene. Because it's interesting to see like 10 years ago when I started drag, like there were so many non-Black people engaging in Blackness, like in this very hyper corporatized, capitalized way, box braids, using the N-word in music, blackface, like Jade noted, all these things. And I remember when I started drag in like 2016, and I saw this and I was like, what's going on here? Like people are not being critical of like what's happening. And I was like the bad person for saying this. And I think now things have changed a bit, particularly because cultural appropriation is a hot topic and everyone's talking about it. And also other things like obviously Black Lives Matter and, Indigenous movements and other feminist movements have really pushed things like the defunding of the police as an abolitionist forefronted issue. Whereas I remember when I started drag, people were still fighting about wanting the police in the Pride Parade. And that wasn't that long ago. That was like 6 years ago, 7 years ago. And now, when I talk to so many drag artists, so many of them who I knew said this 5 years ago have now pivoted. But I always wonder, is that pivot because of actual engagement or is that pivot because of fear of canceling, right? Because sometimes they say, they'll put BLM in their Instagram bios, but I don't see them ever show up for the Black artists. I don't ever see them coming to sort of, I even think about, sorry, I'm taking up so much time to some of these examples, but I even think about Michelle Ross, like when she was alive, how she was still positioned at Cruise and Tangos like in the early show. And I remember when I started my my research, I was reading about all these, really pivotal, legendary drag artists, Black drag artists who were never given access to like certain spaces, meaning, when a certain time hits, I even know that I've produced shows in the Village and there had been times when it would like 9:30 would hit and the bar owner would come out and be like, okay, you guys are doing all this racialized music, you're doing rap and soca and dancehall and whatever, that like, he would never say this, but it was code for like, the twinks are coming in, the white twinks are coming in, we need to change the cast so that like, the sound is more appealing to them so that they'll spend more money. So it always came back to like money and capital, right? And again, I think to bring all these examples to the forefront is again, it's interesting to hear what happened to Jade because I was like, as someone who didn't spend a lot of time in the Village, I've never felt like the Village was freeing at all. Like it actually felt more confining than say when I go to Brampton or Mississauga or Scarborough and get booked there. Sometimes by not even, queer organizers or, who come from queer experience, but have a politics of queerness that is much more radical than I think than what happens in the village, where it's all just about turning a look, doing 15 songs, making sure you look cute at the end and then going home. It's just, I think it's again, it's speaking back to all these sorts of things that we've like lost sight of in Canada.
Yeah, thanks for that. One of the things that when you were talking, I thought about immediately, especially around policing, was that they're actually using the excuse of, hypertransphobia and homophobia to hire more, to give more money to the police officers.
Yeah.
But, who actually feels protected and safe by them? It's mostly gay, white, cis men who attend the parade, right? Like, so it's interesting to see that connection there. Sorry, Jake, go ahead.
Well, I've lost several points. I wanted to jump in so badly when you were saying certain things. The police and the Pride Parade. The first thing that I noticed when I got here is that it's the best photo op for the police department. For them to be in the parade and walking in their uniforms and all that stuff and interacting with people so it could be photographed makes it look like they're so into the community, all that stuff. But I was here doing the Bruce MacArthur thing and watched how that all played out. And even down to the meeting that they had at the 519, and they, people were saying, this is a serial killer in our community. And they were like, no, we don't think that that's it at all. And so to find out that like they had him in custody, they let him go, they, all of these things, and people who came to them and said, this man attacked me, and they lived to be able to go and tell, and they did not do anything. So, and then finally, one white man goes missing and all hell breaks loose. Now, all of a sudden, it's a manhunt. And so, and I got in trouble for saying that too, which who cares? I said it. But the thing of it is it's so obvious when you look around at everything that's going on, how everything is set up for white gay men, and how we don't have any women bars. There's no lesbian bar. Why is that? All spaces are created here for white gay men. And then when you speak about it, you are cast out or you are not booked or whatever. And then I'm not going to name the queen, but I'm sure that you're going to know exactly who I'm talking about cultural appropriation. There is a certain queen who is very big on the scene, who does a lot of Black artists, but is not Black, and did not speak up not once during the Black Lives Matters thing at all, when she should have. Like, the reason that Justin Timberlake got in trouble when he made his little comment on Jesse Williams, I think is his name, on his thing on Twitter, is because during Black Lives Matters and all of those things that went on, you didn't part your lips at all. But now all of a sudden, because of this guy gave a great speech at the BET Awards, you want to say something? No, they really let him have it, as well as they should have. And to me, artists like him, Justin Bieber, all of these white artists who actually profit off of Black music, they should have been right at the front, and saying something and speaking up. It was weird looking at old pictures of the March on Washington back when Martin Luther King was still around, and seeing, Marlon Brando and all that. But these people actually put their money where their mouth was. They threw their support, and they didn't care about their career. They went out to support. Nowadays, these artists, they just sit back and they don't say a word at all. And then they want to chime in at an opportune moment to make it look like they're right there in the movement. but they're not doing anything and they're not saying anything when they should be. So to have a drag queen that is on the scene and profiting off of being Black on stage, but she's a good girl and she's not going to cause any waves and she's not going to say anything bad because she wants that paycheck and they want to make sure they have that person of color because there are tokens in the system as well. And the other thing that I notice is that and I'm not going to name these queens names either, but queens wearing Popeye's chicken dresses on stage. Don't do that. Don't play into the stereotype that that they have. I remember one day someone who had been to my shows came up to me as I was leaving a Popeye's chicken and he was like, "Oh yeah, you love that chicken at Popeye's." And I looked at him and I was like, "Oh, you really think that that's like okay and that like you're really putting a stamp on I'm a Black queen." And I wasn't in drag at the time, but those kind of things that fuels and keeps those microaggressions going, and people, that becomes the narrative and that becomes the way that people address other people because of they watch other people do it. And so that's the reason it's so important that we have to speak up when these things happen. How many times have I heard someone tell me, "Oh, you speak so well." Well, I was about to curse, but how am I supposed to speak? What is it that you thought I was? Did you thought I was going to be Mushmouth from Fat Albert Gang and be like, "Ah, boo, 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 boo"? I don't talk like that. So, but that's the narrative. That's what they've been taught. So, too much. But anyway, I'll let you get back to it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, both of you. Yes, and as you were talking, Jade, I was thinking about how actually, this whole, around like policing and, again, like, and this is part of like fascism thriving, and also like creating these situations where like, people just kind of don't speak up, right? Like they kind of like where they are in the status quo and they don't speak up, and that's exactly how fascism thrives. So yeah, and which kind of brings me to the next question. We noticed that, one of the things that I personally saw was fascism particularly started thriving during the pandemic. And I think a part of that was this isolation and people not being able to connect, and to organize and do all those things, So I wanted to see what your thoughts are on that, around, resisting that at the moment, and resisting. How do we do that? How do we resist isolation? Because I feel like that has become, after 3 years, people are kind of still getting used to being out and about. I've noticed that about myself, but yeah. How do we come back from that?
Well, the weird thing is so for a decade now, I've been producing events for the HIV positive community. They started off as POSTO. Unfortunately, because of pressure, I had to change the name because some people would not come to an event that had the word pause in it. But that was the whole point of it in the beginning, was that I felt we needed to be out about who we were and let people know that like we're not ashamed of living with HIV. I've been HIV positive since 1989, diagnosed in 90. And I get, that's another thing, the other pushback for me in the village, Ryan, is that like I've been very open and out about my status. So people don't know how to handle that. They don't know how to handle someone who is standing in their truth about who they are and what they are. They want you to fit into their box. But as far as fighting fascism. And I think the way that we do that is, one, we need to start addressing people in person again. And like, if it starts with just one person or whatever, go meet your friend. Don't just text. Don't just pick up the phone. Go meet your friend and sit with them and talk to them face to face. Because of my thing is if you can't say whatever it is that you're going to say to a person's face, then you really shouldn't say it. So anything that I have to say, I would say it to the person's face. Anyone that I talked about today, I would say it to their face, because of, I want them to know this is how I feel. And also it teaches people how to interact again. I think that more so than the pandemic, the internet has just really ruined how people interact with each other, because people hide behind keyboards and they say horrible things to other people that they don't even know, and they get away with it because they can turn their computer off. But if in face-to-face, in actual one-on-one interactions, you wouldn't behave that way. And if you did, it would be probably a fight, because I know if you said some stuff to me that I didn't particularly care for, you might get punched in the face. But, that's the thing is that we need to start working on getting our community back in front of each other and working with each other. I remember when all the Black Lives Matters thing happened, I tried desperately for a couple of months after the shutdown of the parade to gather Black Lives Matters. I wrote to some of the people who were in charge at that moment. I wrote to Kristen Wong Tam's office. No one got back to me. There was like 3 people that got back to me, but they weren't people who were in power. They just wanted to be at the table to have this conversation. And how different would it have been if we were able to actually get all those people together to sit down and talk, not in the public forum that happened months later over at Daniel Center or whatever it was, where they had their meeting or whatever. That was a nightmare. A lot of screaming, yelling, and protesting and all that stuff. Had they all sat down privately and not in a public forum and just sat and talked about what went on, why it went on, they could have fixed the situation and diffused all that. But instead, they let it fester for several months, and it just got worse and worse. So all the horrible things that white gay men wanted to say about Black Lives Matters, that was being put out. And all the things of the Black people who were mad at the white gay men for what they said, that went out. So, we need to learn how to get back in each other's faces, but without yelling or any of those things, just to listen. That's the biggest part. Listening is probably the best way to fix this. That's the advice that I give to a lot of my white friends when they're like, oh my God, I didn't know that it was this bad. And I didn't know. I was like, listen, just, if you had been listening, you probably would have seen or heard something, but you weren't. You were busy talking or, whatever you were doing. So learn to listen. That's what I would say.
Absolutely. And I think another part of it is just accountability, right? Like we could absolutely hold each other accountable while holding each other with compassion. I think that's something that it's really important for us to be able to practice, as a community as a whole. So, Ryan.
Yeah, no, I sort of agree with everything Jade is saying, but I think also again, this notion of being able to hear other people, I think is really important. I think there's so much with identity politics and the way that it exists right now. There's so much, about the individualistic and this insular reading practice that is not able to think outside of itself, which really inhibits the work that we do, which is why certain gay men can say, stop bringing race into the conversation, because of course, if they only think with themselves, of course their point is not attached to race. But for those of us who are racialized, we're all racialized, but for those of us who are people of color, Black, Indigenous, etc., our sexuality is co-constructed by our race and other things as well. So you can't ever just, remove it from the conversation. But I think, to your question about pandemic, was really interesting when the pandemic happened, because all of us kind of went into fight or flight mode. I felt like either people just like got really into like the digital Zoom space, or people just were like, I hate this. And I think we're sort of in this moment now where I think Zoom parties are not obviously at the height of what they were, but I think what it also did show is that people were really resilient for space, right? I think the people that were doing the most work were the organizers who were actually putting these spaces together when, you know, when we went through that like ridiculous 13-month lockdown, which apparently was like one of the longest lockdowns in the world in Ontario, right? Really so many, like, even I think about the look at the work of DJs at that time, like literally building these like digital spaces for people to like do drag and perform in their, you know, their living rooms and basements and whatever. And it was sort of really cool to see, because I also think it allowed us outside of what we knew drag to be, where like sometimes I would produce shows and like there'd be people coming from like South Asia and the Caribbean and like wherever, because it was on Zoom, right? So like anyone could attend. And I'm with that also more forms of violence open up, but I think also more points of connection also opened up to think about like what could be possible. Like, I think for me, like what's been really cool is like a couple of months ago, I was part of this like climate justice, feminist, eco-justice show that was like all drag and burlesque artists like from around the world. And it was based in Taiwan. And I got to be sort of one of the people that was from Canada, but to actually experience drag that I would never have been able to experience unless I had physically traveled there and gone to a drag show or whatever. And I'm someone who's like, I don't love Zoom shows in terms of as a drag artist, because it's so much work to be in a box for, I'm sure Jade understands this as well, is like, you don't really get the full experience of drag when you're in a little box, right? You need, you know, drag is a very multi-sensory experience, right? Like smell, movement, sensation, like there's a lot of sound, there's a lot of stuff going on at once. And the Zoom space really inhibits that to sort of one angular version of what you're seeing. But at the same time, I think in terms of like connection, it also really like forced us to like actually move beyond what we knew. And get out there, because I think particularly in Toronto too, the drag is very insular, right? There's again, these like separate camps. There's a lot of people trying to carve out their own path, and that's great. You know, it's really important that people are doing this work, but what ends up happening is that, like, as Jade said, the people who can maintain their privilege and power because of certain things, whether it's class, whether it's racial privilege, whether it's gender privilege, whatever, get to maintain those spaces. And I think the thing I miss the most, I don't even miss, I don't think we've ever had it in Toronto, but when I've gone to other cities to perform, there is a sense of like camaraderie and like connection between wanting to see what other people are doing, right, in the space. And when there's only 3 drag queens there for 3 hours in a like 3-hour set, and then it just switches, there's not really a ton of space to actually be building that work together, I think. Whereas I've seen this in different cities, and it becomes much more powerful when people are allowed to like engage in the art form beyond just like, you know, here's a $5 bill, right? Because that's a lot of sort of what I see happening in Toronto. So I think we're definitely still struggling, but the other thing too is, you know, me and Jade obviously are like-minded in this space, but a lot of the drag scene is not. And so I think one of the things I think about all the time is, yes, we can have all these ideas, but if we are not able to speak to each other and translate our ideas to each other without us like wanting to like destroy each other, then I feel like we're never going to get anywhere. Because so many times too, like, you know, we have these ideas in our circles and our spaces, but there are so many drag artists that would be like, no, cultural appropriation is fine, right? Or, you know, no, like this is totally fine with me, because like what Jade brought up that example of, oh, well, I have a Black friend and she said it was fine, as if having one Black friend can stand for the entire world, right? Or can stand for an entire system. It's, you know, it's that same sort of logic, you know, we always see with like, say, like white folks or like Karens, you know, those Karens we see online that are like, oh, I did this because I told this person I knew about it and he said it was fine. And it's like, but that's not good enough. That's not a good enough answer to produce harm and violence, right? And I think, you know, particularly again with this notion of amnesia, is like drag was supposed to be like first of all, I mean, one of the things I'll say is one of a good friend of mine who's an Indigenous drag queen. I remember one time she said to me, she's like, drag is or she was an Indigenous drag queen. Drag is a trans art form, not in terms of an identity politic, but thinking beyond yourself, because the prefix trans actually means to go beyond, right? So we can think about the things we do to our bodies in terms of going beyond what we have access to, right? Thinking about the ways in which we use like lip sync and comedy and storytelling to actually deal with like real structural issues, right? Like when we think about some of the most, pivotal foundational drag artists, they were not doing drag just for fun. They were doing drag because they felt necessity, right? Like there was something calling them to do drag, or, I think, the question I would ask for J2 is like, you just said your age, and I'm thinking about like what calls you. There's so many issues in drag, right? There's so many sort of hegemonic politics, but like something still calls you to it, obviously, right? That brings you back. And I think, for me, it's the political power of drag and like what it could offer. But I feel like there's so many people that are okay with the subpar, if we can call it that, or okay being, neutral, right? Or apolitical, even though that doesn't even make any sense. But there's so much like okayness with that. Like everyone is okay to just not disturb. And so it's like, I always think about what is then our role as these, people who are interested in the political power of drag when like maybe the vast majority are not, right? And then how do we do our work if even our community, what we see as our community can't read into us? How are we supposed to ever translate this to people who don't want us here, right? When the people who we see ourselves connected to are not even able to hear us. Like that's, I think, the really scary part of it all.
Thank you. Sorry, Jade, I was gonna actually ask you that. I'm also wondering what called you to, yeah.
Well, I mean, it's really interesting. I was just telling a friend of mine the other day on the phone that though when I left Florida, I left because I didn't want my family and friends to know that I was HIV positive. And most people who lived in Tampa, Florida moved to Atlanta. And I was just like, oh, child, I'm not going there to see some more people that I already know. So I moved to New York City. And the one thing that I thought was going to ruin me, me being HIV positive, me being gay, all of these things, these are the things that are sustaining me now. I think what drives me to continue doing drag is I have stories to tell. Okay, so in indigenous cultures or in most cultures, the elders, they teach the past, they tell how you cook, how you do all of these things. And if they're not there to tell those stories, then what happens? There's a gap. So because there were so many people we lost during the HIV/AIDS epidemic, I just feel like, okay, I'm still here. I must be here for a reason. So I'm here to tell my story. And I was on season 3 of Drag Heels, and I got to tell my story there. Not as much as I wanted to on the actual show, but if you go to the live, on YouTube, they have the finishing product of the live show. And I got to tell my story there the way that I wanted to tell it. That's what drives me. That's what keeps me in the game, is that I know that hopefully if I get one young person to listen to what my experience was, maybe it'll help them in their future decisions about how they live their life, where they're going to go, what they can and cannot do. Because I never took, when someone told me that I couldn't do something, that just made me want to do it more. So I just got up, and I figured out a way to do it. A lot of I think the craziest thing for me about Toronto is I've been told no a lot since I've been here. But everything that I wanted to do, I found a way to do it. And I don't have any money. So, that in itself, creating something out of nothing, that's a talent. I don't often toot my own horn, but that's a talent. And to teach someone else how to do that, that would be brilliant. To teach another generation of people that you can do this stuff and you don't have to be rich. I've traveled the world. I've been all over Europe. I've been, in different cities or whatever. I've been flown places to go perform because I have a story to tell. There's something in me that I think relates when I'm on stage, and not everyone pays attention. Some people want you to do flips and dance and, light yourself on fire. I'm not doing all that. But I have a story to tell, and I think that that is the reason that I'm still interested in doing drag, and probably will do it until I'm gone. So
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, Jade. I can relate to it in some ways because I'm almost 47. And as a trans person, 47 is pretty old. A lot of trans people don't make it to, this age. And I see myself as being quite privileged. I have a career, I have family, I have so that's, and it's really important for me to let young people see that, young trans people, to see that reflected so that they could see there's possibilities. So I think possibilities and hope is what we're talking about here for the future, because we're talking about so many dark things, rising of fascism, homophobia, and and resisting those things, which is, the drag performance is a form of obviously resistance in itself, right? And which brings me to my very last questions, because we do have 5 minutes left, and the time just went by so quickly because this was such a lovely conversation, and it just dawned on me. But yeah, I'm wondering about walking towards liberation, our liberation, walking towards, yeah. Where do you see that? Where do you see, hope for a future where, being drag, performing in any way, or being trans is not, an issue anymore? How do you see that future? Where do you see that future?
I think, well, I mean, I'm brought back to the words of Harvey Milk, you got to give them hope. It is so important that we do see light at the end of the tunnel, that that there is something else ahead of us. And I just think about all the possibilities of all the people who are being born now. I want their world to be, free of these problems. Like this shouldn't be an issue anymore. Like, smallpox or whatever, that it got obliviated. I would like these things to be, in the past. We're fighting those fights right now, so the future kids and the future people can go and live their lives the way that they want to live, and not have to conform or do what other people told them to do. But it's a tough fight, but it's an important fight. And so that's what I see as the hope for the future, is that we're fighting for tomorrow's generations. So
Yeah, as Mariam Kaba says, hope is a discipline, right? Ryan, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I think to speak back to like what Jade said, I'm someone who's not interested as much as mainstreaming drag or normalizing drag, because I think drag's political power is that it disrupts the normal, right? And so I think if there ever becomes and I mean, also what we've seen is drag has somewhat become mainstreamed, or I would say a particular type of drag has become mainstreamed because of things like RuPaul's Drag Race, but we haven't seen any sort of more free life or a freer life than when we were before RuPaul's Drag Race, right? I would say
it's because Ru isn't going to rock the boat. Ru
right,
is exactly where Ru is, and Ru is making the money that they never thought that they were going to. When Ru was doing crack back in New York City, nobody remotely thought that Ru was going to be this person. So, and Ru's not going to rock the boat. So
yeah. But I just mean, I think we hear a lot of this discourse around like representation matters, and it does. But at the same time, like we do have representation and we still are not any freer, right? So I think about, for me, like, as I said, drag for me is like a rehearsal, right? It's not about me trying to become a new confinement of gender that's been prescribed in the world for us, right? But I think what drag does is it allows you in a very temporary moment to rehearse what it could be like to be free. Like that's what I think about, right? Because I think about drag, whatever the ways in which we think about drag allows us into a, space to like feel freedom in any capacity, whether that's through song, through dance, through aesthetic, through whatever, through joy, through intimacy, for these particular moments, which is what I think why it calls us back so often. But for me, I think drag is useful in that it allows us to think about what that ephemeral moment could be if it wasn't ephemeral, or what is that, if that temporary moment of more freedom in drag could exist, what would it mean for us to like elongate that period so that it wasn't just contained to, you know, the nightclub or the gig or like just, you know, the fashion elements of it, but as a real like pedagogy for how like we want to live in the future. But yeah, I think that's where I kind of see the hope of it for, is that like drag will always change and will always shift, right? And even when things like Drag Race and every other TV show they want to create about drag, when all those shows end, drag will continue, right? And it will change and it will move in its own direction. And so I think what will be interesting in the drag world is to see when like these big corporate moguls end, right? Like the life after all this stuff, because so much now, as Jade has talked about, is like tied to capital and culture production and a very particular form of culture production. And so when these avenues no longer exist, it's going to be interesting to see like what is drag going to look like in like 2040, right? In these same cities when these things are no longer. And it doesn't mean that they're going to be gone. It just means that it will forever change what drag will turn into, right? Which is both good and bad. But I think my hope kind of lives in that drag sort of continues to teach us what it needs to teach us. And we have to be willing, I think, to listen, which is hopeful for me in terms of all the things we've been talking about today.
Right. And of course, like, you know, drag or any kind of resistance in that form calls into questions these regimes of capitalism, you know, individualism, patriarchy, racism, all those kind of things, right? So with all this being said, I want to thank you two for being here. This was such an honor and such an amazing conversation. And yeah, this was amazing. And I'm hoping that these kind of conversations will continue on again. And I want to thank everyone for being with us. And yeah, have a great night, everyone. Take good care of yourselves and each other.
Thanks so much. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.